Delle grandi istituzioni che regolano i mercati, quelle di Cina, Stati Uniti e Unione Europea, quali ti sembrano più consapevoli e sensibili al problema posto dal libro Il paradosso del profitto, cioè quello dell'enorme potere di mercato che alcune aziende hanno acquistato grazie soprattutto alla tecnologia?
It is actually interesting that there is a growing consensus across the world that the big tech has become too powerful and needs to be regulated. So this has not always been so. In the United States in particular, there has been a deep-seated fear that regulation is harmful, it deters innovation, and that the government just does not have the understanding of the technology to intervene in these markets. There has been much more faith in self-regulation of the technology industry. So the EU for quite some time has taken a different approach, and there is less faith in the markets and more faith in the government's ability to intervene, including through antitrust laws. So if you think about over the last decade, there have been 3 big cases against Google, fines amounting to 10 billion in total imposed by the EU. There have been open cases against Meta, Apple, recent settlement in the case involving Amazon, and yet another case against Google. So there certainly has been much more of an understanding in the EU that the tech companies need to be regulated. But there has not been as much control of mergers. So there has been big gaps, many would argue. And if you look at, for instance, some of the tremendous insights in the profit paradox, where Eeckhout proposes how we ought to, for instance, control mergers, for instance, require an approval of all the mergers or reverse the burden of proof on the harms versus the benefits of the merger. Those are some examples of where one could say, and he certainly argues, where the EU merger control falls short. So even in the EU, there has been an understanding of many of these harms, but one could argue that, for instance, there have been acquisitions such as Facebook's purchase of Instagram or WhatsApp that have fallen underneath the radar and that have contributed to the market power that the company has today. So I also want to mention the third major regulator, China. So we have seen a significant reversal in China's approach towards the tech industry. So quite some time, China was really focused on becoming a technological superpower, and it needed also its tech companies to grow. So it was shielding its own tech companies from competition, but at the same time, adopting a very lenient regulatory approach towards these companies. But the last couple of years, since 2020, that changed. So now China has engaged in a crackdown of the tech industry. And one of the motivations is this idea that we need to have greater common prosperity. We need to share the gains from digital revolution so that not only the large leading platform companies get the benefits, but that they share the prosperity with the society at large. So we are seeing right now, and this is why I think the timing of this book is so important, is that we are seeing the governments around the world potentially reversing or reassessing their approach towards regulation. And that is happening in the United States as well. There certainly is at least a conversation that there is a sort of second thoughts on whether this market-driven laissez-faire approach is the appropriate one and whether the Congress should act with a more forceful antitrust laws that are better suited for the problems of the technology industry. And a greater control of mergers, for instance, that would prevent these concentrated markets from emerging in the first place.
Il paradosso del profitto non analizza solo il potere di mercato che deriva dall'acquisizione e fusione di più imprese, ma anche e soprattutto quello che deriva dall'enorme crescita organica di imprese come Amazon o Google che hanno saputo utilizzare la tecnologia in modo estremamente efficiente, sbaragliando i concorrenti. Ci sono attualmente norme per contrastare il potere di mercato acquistato in questo modo o per limitare i danni che esso crea per i lavoratori e i loro salari?
So, yes, there are regulations to counter the market power of these companies. I already talked about how the EU has been leading the charge, how China is increasingly building its regulatory architecture. The United States is debating laws, but it is very uncertain still whether we see something happen in practice. But one can also criticize whether the EU's laws have been effective. So the EU has been bringing cases under its antitrust laws against the leading tech companies. Yet it is fair to say that competition remains still limited in these markets. The market power of these leading companies remains unlocked. So for that reason, the EU is increasingly now conscious of the deficiencies of the enforcement of its antitrust laws and sought new powers to enforce through this adoption of Digital Markets Act, the DMA, which is an ex-ante regulation that would really shift the approach towards market power, vesting the Commission with the power to ex ante impose certain obligations on these companies, what they can do and what they cannot do. And interestingly, some of the very, I would say, creative and fundamental proposals that Eeckhout puts forward in his book are indeed now embedded into the Digital Markets Act, calling for greater interoperability, limiting to some extent the ways that the companies can appropriate the data and refuse to share it with their rivals. So I think it is now the big question of whether the DMA can deliver its potential and show that the European Union is actually capable of enforcing its new regulation in a way that we see an actual shift in the structure of the markets and the outcomes in the marketplace. What I find really interesting in the profit paradox is that it talks about the impact of market power into labor. And we have thus far been very focused on product markets and not labor markets. But that conversation is also shifting. There was a recent speech by the chair of the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission in the United States, Lina Khan, that reminded people that the FTC has also power over labor markets and not product markets, and how we do need to be more mindful in thinking about leveraging the antitrust powers to also influence the outcomes in the labor market. One example that she mentioned was the regulation of non-compete agreements that then influence whether the workers are able to move from one job to another. But I would say that anybody reading the profit paradox would say that we still have a long way to go before we have the kind of antitrust laws across the different places that will actually deliver on the potential. One of the things that I really liked in the profit paradox was this idea that it is more nuance in thinking about that we see people and we hear people call for the breakup of these companies. But Eeckhout, even though he is clearly pro-regulation, is more mindful of the downsides of such drastic move. For instance, breaking up these companies, unwinding the mergers that have already been consummated. But he rather would impose behavioral remedies on what do we expect these companies to do in terms of exclusive dealing, data sharing, interoperability, and so forth. And that I find a particularly welcome conversation that the book is inviting.
Il tuo prossimo libro, in uscita a settembre negli Stati Uniti, è dedicato agli imperi digitali. Quali sono, dal tuo particolare punto di vista, i principali problemi posti da questo tipo di imprese, soprattutto quelli nascosti dai grandi vantaggi che tutti noi traiamo da esse?
My next book, Digital Empires, The Global Battle to Regulate Technology, is really focusing on this moment in time where the societies are at an inflection point and are looking to find the way to regulate technology. And we have competing approaches there. There is the American market-driven model, there is the Chinese state-driven model, and there is the European, what I call a rights-driven model. And there are many problems that have triggered these regulatory responses, even though the response has been different in many places. There's been concerns about privacy and what it does to personal autonomy and our self-determination. There has been concerns about market power, many of the concerns that are discussed in the profit paradox, and the idea of what it does to the markets and whether there's a way to introduce more fairness to the marketplace. And there's been concerns about democracy, including with the spread of disinformation online through these leading platforms. And online content more generally, whether we think about the fundamental rights and human dignity and anti-discrimination, if we allow these platforms to host a speech that is consists of hate speech, terrorist content, and other harmful or illegal material. So these are just few examples of what the regulators are trying to respond to. And the question is whether they are able to wage this battle effectively. So in the book, I distinguish between horizontal and vertical battles. So we have all these governments fighting vertical battles vis-a-vis tech companies on their markets. But one thing that makes it very difficult to go after these tech companies is that the companies are also regulating in an increasingly tense geopolitical environment, where we also have a horizontal battle between the various regulators in the US and the EU that have their regulatory differences, whether on antitrust, on transfer of data and privacy, how to balance surveillance with fundamental rights, or whether we impose digital taxes on these companies. We also have another horizontal battle, a very prominent one, between US and China. So the tech war is also constraining the ability of the US and China to go after their companies, because they still need to make sure that they can fuel technological progress and growth in order to prevail in the tech war against one another. So that is one thing that is making it more complicated to respond via regulation. But it's also difficult to regulate these companies effectively, because technologies are not only harmful, they certainly are very beneficial. And the governments need to make sure that they are not regulating in ways that then deprives the societies and individuals of all the good things that technology and innovation brings to the societies. So if we think about, for instance, regulating the content online, hate speech, whether we think about copyright infringements online, whether we think about disinformation. The Europeans, for instance, have been very mindful that freedom of expression is a core fundamental right. And any attempt to have the platforms remove information also need to be consistent with the idea that we do not overdo it. So we also preserve the freedom of expression. So this line drawing is particularly hard, especially in democracies where you are balancing various concerns about freedom of expression and about the other concerns, including personal privacy and human dignity. So the task is monumental. The battles around how to go about those regulatory tasks is very prominent. And the book is trying to bring analytical clarity in showing who is fighting for what the stakes are, and how the big battles are likely to unfold.